Toren is a video game that left me with many mixed feelings. It's not exactly a disappointment, but I feel that it was the ending of what was supposed to be a much bigger game. It doesn't feel like the video game equivalent of a novelette. It was more akin to the final chapter and epilogue of an epic novel. Toren is imperfect, and though it does have some flashes of brilliance, it's not a game that I can strongly recommend. Toren is a 3D platformer from the Brazilian developer Swordtales. It's their debut game. In Toren, you play as Moonchild, who's trapped in the titular Tower of Toren. The tower, you see, was built to pierce the heavens, and it thus invoked the wrath of the gods. This folly did not go unpunished, and the sun was chained in place, to beat down forever upon the tower. The Moonchild, imprisoned within, is destined to climb the tower, and that's all I can say about the game's backstory without spoiling too much. There is, however, a dragon that waits on the tower, and it causes you trouble throughout the game. I really like the way that Toren set up the story. The concept is really high and really interesting. Unfortunately, the issue with Toren is that the story is very vague. In most parts of the game, the execution either wasn't quite strong enough, or came on too hard and too obvious. Toren, you see, aims to have a mythopoeic quality, and while that's an admirable thing, the execution is just lacking. I'm not opposed to a thought-provoking story, but Toren feels more like an interesting story that's wrapped up in platitudes. There are lots of symbols and conceptual elements to the game, but ultimately they don't feel like they really go anywhere. While the story could often be obtuse, I did like the way that it was sometimes told. The area that Toren really stands out in is with regards to its aesthetics. To call Toren a pretty game would be a criminal understatement. Visually speaking, it's one of the most beautiful games I've played this year. While there were some little graphical glitches, for instance, at some points in the game, the Moonchild's clothing kind of seems to sink through her skin. This is kind of unnerving to observe. There were also some issues with texture popping. However, besides these problems, the game was very pretty. Toren makes such fantastic use of lighting, camera angles, and colors to create something lovely. Toren almost feels as though it falls somewhere between a video game and a movie. Unfortunately, while the game's cinematic focus is at times a source of beauty, it can also be a point of contention. Most of the game's cutscenes, you see, were built to meld seamlessly into the gameplay, and unfortunately some of the seams start to show when the camera angles are kind of awkward when you're popping back into the game. When the thing works, it's fantastic, but when it fails, you'll probably run into some issues such as running over the edge of something, or getting killed by the dragon, and it won't be your fault. Besides the occasional camera issues, Toren does have some other problems with regards to its gameplay. Now, Toren is pretty much your average 3D platformer, albeit one that doesn't have very much challenge. While I do like the focus on the story in Toren, I feel as though the gameplay was built around the framework of the story, and it didn't work out. As a game, Toren is too easy and too obvious in far too many places. There isn't really anything to figure out or uncover. For such a story-oriented game, discovery is paramount. Whether or not you think of experiences such as Dear Esther as video games, where Dear Esther succeeded in telling a story was not with arbitrary puzzles to solve or monsters to kill, but because it employed its exploratory mechanics in conjunction with beautiful prose. By comparison, while Toren has plenty of beautiful prose, it's not in harmony with the game's mechanics. The pacing of everything, the story and the gameplay, it feels wrong, perhaps because there's a lack of tension. I found myself growing bored around the tower, occasionally fighting off the strange headcrab-like creatures to no real end. I didn't feel that there was anything at stake, or that there was a mystery to uncover, or that there was a world to explore. The only thing that kept me going was the promise of learning a little bit more of what the backstory was, and perhaps seeing some more vagaries that the story tossed at me. That's the only reason that I kept running, jumping, and swinging my sword. I otherwise didn't feel any real motivation. Additionally, I kind of hated some of the game's mechanics. For instance, at some points, it's necessary to draw over a symbol with a small sack of salt. As I mentioned before, the game is rife with symbols, and I thought the little ritual was interesting, but I didn't feel as though it really went anywhere. And to make matters worse, it wasn't engaging to do, and mechanically, it was kind of a pain. I had a very hard time moving the Moonchild around. Much of the time, I wound up pouring the salt outside the lines of the symbol, and I had to keep going over and over and over it again until I finally got it right. That was not fun. While it was certainly challenging, it was challenging because the game made it mechanically difficult to do, and you couldn't always replicate your results. Additionally, Toren's gameplay does also have some glitches. At a couple of points, I fell right through the world. That was pretty infuriating. Seeing as death in Toren isn't too consequential, it wasn't too big of an issue since it didn't happen often, but those couple of times that it did occur, it really was frustrating. In spite of the issues, however, I'm not completely writing off the gameplay in Toren, because, like the game's other aspects, there are the occasional flashes of brilliance. Sometimes, quite literally, as in the level that's illuminated almost entirely by lightning flashes. Admittedly, I do think that the lightning in the level should have been a little more frequent, but besides that, it was a really cool concept. Then, too, there was also a level in which the floor became invisible, and it became necessary to look up in order to navigate through it, otherwise you'd fall off the edge. So while Toren did have issues with lackluster platforming, some of the levels were really, really cool. The lightning flash level and the invisible floor level, in spite of their brevity, they were really great, both aesthetically speaking, and as far as gameplay goes. Overall, Toren is a game that left me liking it in bits and pieces. It does have some very serious flaws. The story feels incomplete as though it's the finale of something much bigger, and the gameplay, which is sometimes really cool, isn't always compelling, and the pacing feels a little bit odd. While the story is nicely told, at times I feel that its vagueness takes away from it. And though there are some little graphical issues, aesthetically, Toren is fantastic. While it's not a game that I can wholeheartedly recommend, I did have some fun with Toren, so if you can see past the game's flaws, and you like strange stories with a mythopoeic quality, you might want to check it out. At the time of this review's creation, Toren is currently available on PC through various digital distribution platforms, as well as on the PlayStation 4.